Hello everyone, and welcome back to Spooky Hut. I know many of you listen to these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you doze off, it would be great if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to hit like and subscribe. Now let's get cozy, relax, and get started. I didn't believe in the stories when they first started circulating around town. A series of clown sightings, each one more unsettling than the last, had apparently begun haunting the quiet streets of Willow Creek. At first, it seemed like a tasteless prank. Some bored teenagers, or maybe an eccentric who'd taken an ill-advised hobby a little too far. But then people started disappearing. I was skeptical, to say the least. I've never been one to fall for urban legends or local hysteria. Still, curiosity got the better of me when my friend Mark called, his voice trembling like a leaf in the wind. He had seen one of the clowns, standing perfectly still under a flickering streetlight on the corner of Pine Street. "You've got to see it for yourself," Mark insisted. "I swear it was just standing there, watching me." I laughed it off, told him it was probably just some idiot trying to freak people out. But then he said something that sent a chill trickling down my spine. "It knew my name," he whispered. It said, "See you soon, Mark." I couldn't shake off the way he said it, as if he was genuinely scared, his voice hollow and distant. Mark wasn't easily rattled, so for him to sound like that, I decided I needed to see for myself what was going on. The night air was unusually cold for October, with a sharp breeze that carried the scent of burning leaves and something else, something foul, like wet earth and rotting wood. The streets were deserted, not a soul in sight, just the hum of faraway traffic and the occasional rustle of wind through the bare branches. As I made my way toward Pine Street, I felt a creeping sense of unease, as if someone were watching me from the shadows. It was quiet, eerily so. Even the usual barking of the neighbor's dog had fallen silent. I reached the streetlight Mark had described, the one on the corner. It was old, casting a weak yellow glow over the pavement. I squinted into the darkness, half expecting to see some faded, grimy costume waiting for me. But there was nothing. Maybe Mark had been imagining things, or maybe someone had dressed up as a clown just to mess with him. I sighed, already feeling stupid for coming out here. Then I saw it. At first it was just a shape, an indistinct silhouette about 50 yards away. But as I focused, the details became clearer. There, just beyond the reach of the streetlight, stood a figure dressed in ragged clown attire. The costume was filthy, streaked with mud and torn at the sleeves. Its face, God, I'll never forget that face. The makeup was smudged, the white paint caked and cracked, revealing patches of pale, sickly skin. The eyes were dark, hollow pits that seemed to drink in the light, and the mouth was stretched into a hideous grin that looked painfully wide, as though it had been cut into the face itself. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't moving. It just stood there staring. "Hey!" I called out, though my voice sounded far weaker than I intended. "You're not scaring anyone, you know." The figure tilted its head, ever so slightly, as if considering me. Then it raised one gloved hand and slowly, deliberately, beckoned me forward with a curling finger. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't some cheap prank. There was something wrong with this thing. I took a step back, and as I did, the clown took a step forward, moving into the faint circle of light. I could see it clearly now. Its eyes weren't painted. They were bloodshot, red-rimmed and glassy, like the eyes of someone who hadn't slept in weeks. Its grin never faltered, even as its lips cracked and bled, and then it spoke. "I've been waiting for you," it rasped, the voice low and raspy like someone choking on gravel. "You're late." I turned and bolted, sprinting down the street as fast as my legs could carry me. I didn't dare look back. The pounding of my footsteps echoed in my ears, and for a moment, I thought I could hear something else. A faint, wheezing laughter. It wasn't loud, but it followed me, a sickly giggle that seemed to grow closer with every step. I burst through the front door of my apartment, slamming it shut and locking it behind me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I could still feel the cold, clammy air of that thing lingering on my skin. I fumbled for my phone and called Mark. It rang and rang, but he didn't pick up. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the darkness, every little creak and whisper of the building setting me on edge. I kept replaying what had happened in my mind, trying to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a really convincing costume. Maybe Mark was in on it. But deep down, I knew there was something more to it. Something sinister. The next morning, Mark was still missing. His car was found parked at Pine Street, but there was no sign of him. The police weren't taking the clown sightings seriously, writing them off as a social media hoax. I couldn't get anyone to believe me when I told them about what I'd seen. They all looked at me like I was crazy. Then I started seeing them everywhere. It began with a glimpse of a faded red shoe just outside my window, or a flash of color in the corner of my eye. Sometimes I'd hear a faint honk, like a clown's nose, echoing in the distance, or that low, wheezing laughter, always just beyond the edge of hearing. It followed me, through the supermarket, down the hallways at work, even in my own bedroom. I began to unravel, the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring together. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, certain I'd felt cold fingers brush against my skin, or find little streaks of white grease paint smeared on my doorframe. I tried to convince myself I was just paranoid, sleep deprived, but the clowns kept appearing. And then, 2 weeks after Mark disappeared, I received a package. It was a small cardboard box, left on my doorstep without a return address. My name was scrawled across the top in a childish, uneven script. With trembling hands, I tore open the box, and my stomach lurched at what I found inside. A clown's mask, the same hideous grin stretched across its face, with one glassy, bloodshot eye sewn onto the front, staring blankly up at me. Beneath it was a folded note, stained with what looked like dried blood. It read, "You're next." I went to the police again, practically begging them to investigate. They humored me this time, probably because of the desperation in my voice. An officer took the mask and the note, promising to run some tests, but I could tell he didn't believe me. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't bear to be alone in that place, not with the feeling that those eyes would be watching me from every corner. Instead, I drove aimlessly for hours, my mind spiraling in a haze of exhaustion and dread. It was nearly 3 a.m. when I finally pulled into a motel parking lot, deciding I needed some rest. As I approached the front desk, I caught sight of a figure out of the corner of my eye, a flash of red and white just outside the glass door. I spun around, my pulse quickening, but there was no one there. Just an empty parking lot, lit by the dim glow of the overhead lamps. I checked in, locking the door behind me and wedging a chair against the handle for good measure. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to the muffled hum of the air conditioner. I could feel myself drifting off when I heard a soft tapping at the window. My blood turned to ice. The curtains were drawn, and for a moment I lay there, paralyzed, praying that it was just the wind. The tapping continued, a slow, rhythmic sound that grew more insistent with each beat. I couldn't take it anymore. I leapt out of bed, yanking the curtains open. There, pressed up against the glass, was the clown. Its pale face and wide grin filled the window, its eyes boring into mine with an intensity that seemed to pierce through to my very soul. Slowly, it raised one finger to its lips, mimicking a shushing gesture, and then it mouthed the words, "See you soon." The lights flickered and went out. I don't remember much after that. I must have blacked out because the next thing I knew I was waking up in the hospital surrounded by beeping machines and the sterile smell of antiseptic. A nurse told me that I'd been found unconscious in the motel room, the window shattered and the room in disarray. They couldn't explain what happened, and I couldn't bring myself to tell them about the clown. The clown sightings around town stopped shortly after that night, and Mark was never found. The authorities eventually wrote his disappearance off as a runaway case, and the mask I'd turned in was apparently lost in evidence storage. But I know what I saw. I know it's not over. Sometimes I still catch a glimpse of faded red in the distance, or hear that faint, wheezing laughter in the dead of night. It's always there, lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I haven't seen it up close since that night at the motel, but I know it's watching, biding its time. And whenever I hear that eerie honking echo down an empty street, I can't help but wonder, am I next? There's a smell in the air tonight. Not the usual scent of rotting fish or wet leaves that I'd come to expect from the shores of Willow Bend Lake. No, tonight it's different. Rancid and sharp, like old blood left to curdle in the summer heat. It's been years since I've stepped foot here, but tonight something has drawn me back, something I don't quite understand. I can still hear the whispers of my childhood friends, even though none of them have returned to Willow Bend since that summer in '98. None of them want to remember. Hell, neither do I. But when I got that call last week, the one with no voice on the other end, just a long, ragged breathing, I knew that something was waiting for me here. The lake stretches out before me, black as the sky, not a ripple disturbing the surface. It looks like a perfect mirror, reflecting the forest that surrounds it, a tangled wall of skeletal trees. The moon hangs low, shrouded by clouds, casting just enough light for me to make out the old dock at the far end. It's weathered and half-rotted, the wooden planks sagging under the weight of years and memories I'd rather not confront. I used to swim here, but after that summer, I could never bring myself to go near the water again, not after we lost Michael. It was the last week of August. The air was sticky with humidity, and the sun had already begun to set when Michael dared us to jump from Dead Man's Cliff. It was a stupid game, something we did just to prove we weren't scared. But when Michael hit the water, he didn't come up. Not for a long time. And when he did, he wasn't the same. He was pale, shaking, his blue lips muttering nonsense. "They're down there," he kept saying. "They're under the water." His wide eyes stared straight past us, like he could still see something beneath the murky depths. That night his parents found him wandering the woods, soaking wet and babbling about pale hands reaching for him. The doctors said it was shock, that he must have hit his head when he jumped. But Michael kept insisting that something had pulled him under, something cold and dead. 3 days later, they found him floating face down in the lake. I never told anyone what I saw that night. How, just before we left the cliff, I glimpsed a dark shape below the surface like a shadow writhing and twisting. How I thought I saw something pale, like fingers, grasping at Michael's legs. But that was years ago. And now, as I step closer to the water's edge, I can't help but feel that same cold chill creep up my spine. The dock groans under my weight, the boards bending and shifting. I half expect them to break, plunging me into the lake's icy grip. The wind picks up, stirring the black water, sending small waves lapping against the shore. It almost sounds like a voice, low and mournful. I strain to listen, half expecting to hear my name. But there's nothing, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. I don't know why I came here alone. Part of me thinks I was always meant to return, to face whatever it was that took Michael. And maybe I'm here because of the dreams. They started a few months ago. Always the same. I'm standing on the edge of the lake, staring down into the dark water. But in the dreams, it's not my reflection that stares back. It's Michael's. I pull out the flashlight from my bag and flick it on, the weak beam cutting through the darkness. The light dances across the water, catching the glint of something floating near the dock. I step closer, leaning over the edge to get a better look. It's just an old piece of driftwood, moss-covered and half-sunken. But for a moment, I swear it looked like a hand. Shaking my head, I step back and scan the shore. That's when I see it. something pale, just beneath the water's surface, a few feet out from the dock. It's faint, almost like a trick of the light, but there's a shape there, moving slowly. My heart pounds in my chest as I shine the flashlight directly at it. The light cuts through the water, revealing nothing. It's gone. I exhale sharply, relief mixing with frustration. I'm seeing things. That's all it is. I'm letting my memories play tricks on me. But then I hear it. A splash, not far from where I'm standing. It's faint, but distinct, like someone tossing a stone into the water. Hello. My voice sounds too loud, too brittle in the stillness. I half expect to hear laughter, to see one of my old friends step out from behind the trees, telling me this is all some elaborate joke. But there's only silence and the low murmur of the wind. Another splash, closer this time. I shine the light toward the sound, and that's when I see it. Something pale and glistening breaking the surface of the water. It looks like a head, hair slick and dark, bobbing up and down in the lake. My breath catches in my throat. It can't be. Michael? The name escapes my lips before I can stop it. I know it's impossible. Michael is dead. Has been for over 20 years. But the thing in the water, it looks like him. It's his face, his hollow eyes staring back at me. A cold dread washes over me as I watch the figure slowly rise out of the lake. Water drips from its gaunt form, skin as pale as the moonlight. I take a step back, the old boards creaking beneath my feet. The figure moves closer, wading through the water, its gaze locked onto mine. It opens its mouth, and a garbled, wet voice spills out. Help. Me. My legs feel frozen, like I'm rooted to the spot. I want to run, to scream, but my body won't respond. It's as though the thing's voice has wrapped around me, pulling me closer to the water's edge. The figure steps onto the shore, its wet feet slapping against the mud. It stumbles forward, reaching out with skeletal hands. No, I whisper, my voice trembling. You're not real, you're not... But then it grabs me. Cold fingers wrap around my wrist and a jolt of icy pain shoots up my arm. Its touch is clammy, and the smell... God, the smell is overwhelming, like damp earth in decay. I yank my arm back, and to my horror, the flesh peels away under its grip like I'm pulling my skin off a rotting fruit. I stumble back, collapsing onto the dock. The figure lurches toward me, its dead eyes wide and pleading. Come back, it croaks. Come back with me. I scramble to my feet and run, my pulse thundering in my ears. I don't stop until I reach the old boathouse, its wooden door hanging crookedly on rusted hinges. I slam the door behind me and collapse against it, my breath ragged and uneven. Outside, the lake is silent once more, the night air still and oppressive. I know I should leave, but I can't shake the feeling that if I turn my back, it will be there, right behind me. I glance around the boathouse, the flashlight beam revealing dust-covered shelves and old tools scattered across the floor. There's a small window on the far wall, its glass smeared with grime. I wipe it clean with my sleeve and peer out. At first, there's nothing. Just the dark water and the faint outline of the dock. But then movement. A ripple on the surface, followed by another. I hold my breath as a pale figure emerges from the lake, followed by another, and another. Dozens of shapes rise from the water, their forms shrouded in darkness. I can see their eyes, glowing faintly, staring straight at the boathouse. They begin to move toward the shore, their movements slow and jerky, like marionettes pulled by invisible strings. My heart races as I realize they're coming for me. I have to get out of here. Now I throw open the door and sprint into the night, my footsteps pounding against the dirt path. The figures are closer now, their voices rising in a low, mournful chorus. Come back. Come back. I reach my car, parked at the edge of the woods, and fumble with the keys, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I finally manage to unlock the door and dive inside, slamming it shut behind me. I turn the key in the ignition, and the engine roars to life. As I speed away from Willowbend Lake, I catch one last glimpse in the rearview mirror. Pale faces watching me from the shore, their eyes glowing with a faint, otherworldly light. The further I drive, the more I try to convince myself that none of it was real. But deep down, I know the truth. Something is in that lake. Something that was never meant to leave. And as I glance at my wrist, at the dark bruise-like marks left by the figure's grip, I realize that a part of me never did. I've always hated dolls. There's just something about their cold glass eyes that unnerves me, like they know something that I don't. But it wasn't until last month that I understood why they terrified me so much. It all began with a missing person case. Ella Matthews was her name, just another teenage girl who went missing in our quiet little town of Bradford. She was the fifth in a month, and the police still had no leads. Kids disappear sometimes, sure, but the frequency was alarming. I thought about it constantly. As a freelance journalist, stories like these got under my skin, but this time, it felt personal. Maybe it was because I'd grown up here, or maybe it was because my best friend Rob was among the missing. Rob had been gone for 2 weeks when I decided to take matters into my own hands. I couldn't just sit around anymore, waiting for the cops to find him, so I started doing some digging on my own. I talked to anyone who might have seen something, a neighbor, a shop owner, anyone who might have the slightest clue. The more I searched, the more it felt like I was being watched, like some unseen force was aware of my investigation. I didn't know what was more unsettling, that feeling or the string of coincidences that began piling up around me. First, the burnt-out streetlights on my nightly walks. Always the same 3, one after another, right before I'd turn onto Elm Street. Then there were the dead birds. I found one on my porch every morning, placed neatly in front of the door, like an offering. The night it all changed, I was at the old Wilcox Theater. It had been abandoned for over a decade, but something about it called to me. Rob had mentioned it before he vanished. He'd told me about a strange performance he'd seen there. His description was cryptic at best, and I figured it was just some local kids messing around. But as I approached the theater that night, the once silent halls felt alive, a faint murmur of voices drifting through the walls. Inside, the air was stale and thick with dust. I crept toward the stage, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. My pulse quickened when I saw it. A single chair placed in the center, facing the empty seats. On it sat a marionette, dressed in a faded Victorian outfit. Its porcelain face gleamed in the dim light, its glass eyes staring blankly ahead. I stepped closer, and then noticed something that made my blood run cold. The marionette's hand was resting on a book, a thick, leather-bound journal that looked as out of place as I felt. The front cover was smeared with dirt, but beneath the grime, I could make out a name: Robert Sinclair. It was Rob's journal. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages, desperate for answers. His handwriting grew increasingly erratic, the words unraveling from coherent thoughts into frantic ramblings. He wrote about being followed, about feeling his movements weren't his own. But it was the last entry that disturbed me the most. It watches from the shadows, it knows my every step. I can hear the strings, pulling at my limbs, bending me to its will. I am not alone in my skin. The words haunted me. Rob had always been grounded, rational. For him to write something so unhinged, it didn't make sense. I shoved the journal into my bag, but before I could leave, I felt it, like a breath on the back of my neck. The marionette was no longer facing the empty seats. It was turned towards me. The flashlight flickered, plunging the theater into darkness. My heart pounded in my ears as I scrambled to the exit. I stumbled outside, gasping for air, only to be greeted by the sound of slow, rhythmic clapping. A man stood at the edge of the parking lot, his face obscured by shadows. "Bravo," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You found the stage. But can you follow the script? I took a step back, unsure if I was facing a threat or merely a madman. Who are you? What do you want? I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. He chuckled and took a step forward, the moonlight illuminating his features. He was tall and gaunt, dressed in a black suit that hung loosely on his thin frame. His eyes were pale, almost white, like polished ivory. But it was his hands that caught my attention. Long, slender fingers that seemed to twitch of their own accord, as if each digit was an individual entity. "You're asking the wrong questions," he replied. "The right question is, what does it want?" Before I could respond, he extended his hand, and with an almost imperceptible flick of his wrist, I felt my body jerk forward, as though yanked by an invisible string. I couldn't control my movements. My limbs twisted and contorted in unnatural ways, mimicking a grotesque dance. Panic surged through me as I realized I wasn't moving by my own will. It was as if I were a puppet, and he was the puppeteer. He waved his hands gracefully, and I followed suit, dancing and writhing against my will. "You see," he murmured, "it doesn't just control dolls, it likes living puppets too." The pressure against my limbs released, and I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. When I looked up, the man was gone. The theater stood silent and empty once more, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened, and it followed me home. That night I barely slept. Each time I closed my eyes, I could hear the faint creak of wood and the rustle of strings, like a marionette shifting in its box. The darkness around me seemed to press in closer, and there, in the corner of my room, I could swear I saw the silhouette of a figure. It was subtle at first, just a slight tightening in my muscles, like an itch I couldn't scratch. But then my limbs began to twitch in my sleep. When I awoke, I was standing in the middle of the room, arms held out as though I were mid-performance. The following days blurred into a waking nightmare. I'd lose hours, entire stretches of time where I had no memory of my actions. I found strange messages scrawled across my walls in my own handwriting, words like dance, obey, perform. It was as if I were living in two minds, one conscious and the other in a deep, unreachable trance. The journal became my only solace. I pored over Rob's final entries, desperate to understand what was happening to me. He'd written about someone, something he called the puppeteer. It was a malevolent entity, he claimed, one that fed on fear and stole control from its victims, making them perform for its amusement. It was drawn to those who meddled in its affairs, who sought out its secrets. And I had done exactly that. One night, when the whispers were at their loudest, I saw him again, the gaunt man with the pale eyes standing in my bedroom doorway. But this time, I wasn't alone. In the shadows behind him, there were others, figures with lifeless expressions and glassy eyes, their limbs jerking in mechanical motions, like dolls in a macabre dance. He stepped forward, a slow, twisted grin spreading across his face. "You've proven yourself quite the performer," he said, "but it's time for the final act." I tried to move, to fight back, but my body froze. My limbs obeyed his silent command as he raised his hands, and I felt my feet lift from the ground, pulled upward by invisible strings. I was suspended in midair, my arms and legs flailing in a nightmarish dance I couldn't control. The other figures circled around me, their empty eyes staring with pity, or perhaps envy, it was impossible to tell. They moved in rhythm to a music I couldn't hear, but somehow, my body responded as though I were intimately familiar with the tune. With a flick of his wrist, the man twisted my body into a grotesque pose, bending my back until I felt my spine strain, my muscles quivering with the unnatural tension. The pain was excruciating, but I couldn't scream. My jaw was locked, my voice stolen. He laughed, a dry, rasping sound. "You see, we're all puppets to something greater," he whispered. "But some of us get to pull the strings." Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. I collapsed to the floor, a heap of bruised limbs and broken pride. The room was empty once more, and I lay there too weak to move, my mind teetering on the edge of madness. Rob's words echoed in my head. It watches from the shadows. It knows my every step. I left town the next morning, unable to bear the thought of staying another night in that place. But no matter where I go, I can still hear it. The faint creak of wood, the pull of invisible strings. It's always there, lurking just beyond the edge of consciousness, waiting for the moment when my guard slips. And when it does, I know it will make me dance again. Now, as I sit here writing this, my hands feel stiff, like they're moving on their own. Maybe that's why I've written it all down, to prove to myself that I still have control. But deep down, I know it's not true. The puppeteer is still out there, pulling the strings, and I am just one more marionette in its endless collection. And one day, when you least expect it, you'll hear the faint whisper of the strings tightening around you too. Then you'll understand. The night I decided to return to Haverhill was cold and starless, as if even the moon had turned its back on that forsaken mining town. It had been 20 years since I left. 20 years since we all fled, scattering like frightened rats from a ship that had already started to sink. I swore I'd never go back, but promises made in terror have a way of fading with time. When I received the letter from my old friend Jake, I should have tossed it into the fire. "I'm going back to Haverhill," he wrote. "Something's been calling me back. I think it's time we faced what happened there." At the bottom, he scrawled a message that sent a chill racing through me. They never left. For days, I tried to ignore it, but each night, I found myself staring at that folded piece of paper on my desk, unable to sleep. It felt like the town had reached out and was gripping my mind. Or maybe, just maybe, the ghosts that haunted Haverhill had finally found a way to pull me back. And that's how I ended up on a rickety old bus that groaned and sputtered as it climbed the winding road into the mountains, towards a place that was better left forgotten. The bus dropped me off at the edge of town, its headlights briefly illuminating the decaying remnants of what had once been a bustling mining community. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and rusting metal. As I walked towards the center of Haverhill, I couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was swallowing me up, inch by inch. The town square was just as I remembered, empty, silent, like a painting of a memory. The old mining equipment still stood, rusted and overgrown with weeds, relics of a time when the earth here was rich with iron and coal. Now it was just a graveyard for ghosts. I made my way to the old hotel where Jake had said he'd be waiting. The hotel was a hulking, dark silhouette against the night sky, its once grand sign hanging crookedly above the entrance. The front door creaked open as I pushed it, the sound echoing down the darkened hallway. "Jake?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no answer, only the low hum of the wind rattling through broken window panes. The air inside was musty and thick with the scent of mildew. Dust coated the faded wallpaper and furniture, remnants of a past that had long since crumbled away. I made my way to the front desk where a rusted bell sat. I hesitated, then tapped it. A sharp ring cut through the silence. Nothing happened. But then, as I turned to leave, I heard it. A faint whisper. It was too quiet to understand, like a voice carried on the breeze from far away. My skin prickled, and I spun around expecting to see Jake standing behind me. But the hallway was empty. I told myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks. I continued down the hallway towards the staircase. The boards beneath my feet creaked with each step, groaning like the bones of an old man. The second floor smelled worse than the first, a blend of rot and stale air that seemed to grow thicker as I walked. I reached room 202, where Jake said he'd be staying. The door was ajar, and the faint glow of a lantern spilled out into the hallway. I pushed the door open, and there he was, sitting in a chair facing the window, staring out at the blackness beyond. "Jake?" I whispered. He didn't move, didn't even acknowledge my presence. "Jake," I said again, louder this time, taking a cautious step forward. That's when I saw it. His eyes were wide open, frozen in terror, his mouth slightly agape as if he had been trying to scream. But his skin was pallid and cold, and I realized with a jolt that he wasn't breathing. He was dead. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't seen or spoken to Jake in 2 decades, and now here he was, dead in a chair in a ghost town. It made no sense. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. I was completely cut off. And then I heard the whisper again. It was closer this time, clearer. "Why did you leave us?" I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. The room was empty, except for me and Jake's lifeless body. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift, deepening, as if something was crawling out of the darkness. I backed out of the room and into the hallway, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I stumbled down the stairs, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, bursting out of the hotel and into the frigid night air. My breath formed puffs of mist as I sprinted down the main street, my footsteps echoing against the broken cobblestones. I thought if I could just get to the edge of town, I could escape whatever was pursuing me. But as I neared the road where the bus had dropped me off, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The bus was still there, parked in the same spot, but the windows were fogged over, and through the mist, I could see faces, dozens of them, pressed against the glass, their mouths moving in silent screams. The bus was filled with people, their eyes hollow and accusing, as if trapped in a moment of terror that would never end. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to the ground, staring up at the bus. That's when I noticed something even more horrifying. The faces on the other side of the glass were familiar. They were the people of Haverhill, the miners, the children, the women who used to work in the shops. They had all disappeared after the last mining accident, the one that shut the town down. We were told they had fled or were relocated to other towns, but they hadn't left. They were all here, trapped in this place, and now so was Jake. And now, so was I. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me. "Why did you leave us? Why did you leave us?" The voices overlapped, growing into a cacophony that drilled into my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears and squeezed my eyes shut, but the voices only grew louder. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. I jumped and spun around, coming face to face with a man I recognized immediately, despite the years. It was Old Man Wilkins, the foreman of the mining company, but he was dead, had been for 20 years. His face was sunken, and his eyes were just empty pits of darkness. His mouth twisted into a smile, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. "We've been waiting for you," he said. I tried to speak, but my voice was trapped in my throat. He pointed towards the mine entrance at the edge of town, the place where the accident had occurred. The wooden beams were rotted, and the entrance was half buried in rubble. The opening gaped like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. "No," I whispered. "I can't go back there." But Wilkins stepped closer, and I could feel the cold radiating from his body. "It's time to face what you left behind," he said. "You owe us." I stumbled backwards, my gaze locked on the mine entrance. I had sworn I would never return to that place. I thought I had escaped the horror, that I could bury the memories of that night deep within my mind. But the ghosts of Haverhill were not so easily forgotten. I could hear the echoes of voices coming from the mine, screams and cries, the sounds of metal grinding and earth collapsing. The noise grew louder, pulling me closer to the dark maw of the earth. It was as if the ground itself was alive, breathing, hungry. With each step I took, I could feel the weight of the town's dead pressing down on me, the years of silence and decay unraveling like the layers of an old wound. As I stood at the entrance, the darkness seemed to pulse, beckoning me forward. I hesitated, but then I heard Jake's voice again, faint and desperate. "Help me." It was a plea I couldn't ignore. I took a step inside, and the darkness swallowed me. The air was thick with dust and the stench of rot. My flashlight cast a feeble glow against the walls, illuminating the old mining equipment that lay abandoned, coated in rust and decay. As I ventured deeper, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The walls seemed to close in, the tunnel narrowing until I had to crouch to continue forward. That's when I saw them. Figures emerging from the darkness, their faces pale and twisted with agony. They were the miners, the ones who had never made it out. Their eyes glowed with an unnatural light as they stared at me, their mouths open as if to scream, but no sound came out. They reached out with skeletal hands, and I stumbled back, tripping over a broken rail. I hit the ground hard, my flashlight rolling away. In the darkness, I could feel their cold breath against my skin, their fingers grazing my clothes. I scrambled to my feet and ran, deeper into the mine, not caring where I was going as long as I could escape those hollow eyes. But as I rounded a corner, I found myself in a dead end. The walls were smooth, carved by some long-forgotten machine. There was no way out. I turned, and the miners were there, closing in. Among them, I saw Jake, his eyes empty, his face twisted in a silent scream. He reached out to me, and I backed against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispers surged, filling the air around me. "You left us," they chanted. "You left us to die." The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was Jake's hand reaching out, pulling me into the depths. Now, I sit here in the darkness, writing this, though I don't know if anyone will ever find it. I can hear them, all around me, whispering, calling my name. They've kept me here, just as they kept Jake and the others. It's like I never left at all. In Haverhill, no one ever really leaves. The ghosts see to that. The darkness had a voice. I didn't realize that until I moved into the new house, and it spoke to me for the first time. It wasn't a voice in the usual sense. There were no words, no coherent language. It was a whisper at the back of my mind, a subtle hiss that seemed to ebb and flow with the flickering of the lights. It called to me, and it didn't take long before I found myself listening. The house itself was nothing special, just a small, two-story Victorian, tucked away on the outskirts of town, surrounded by woods on all sides. It had character, the real estate agent said, a fixer-upper, but a solid choice for a writer like me, someone who needed the quiet, who thrived on solitude. It was perfect, I'd thought, ideal for getting my new novel off the ground. But even from the first night, I could sense something wasn't quite right. It started with the shadows. They didn't behave the way shadows should. At night, the corners of the rooms grew darker than seemed natural, as if the light struggled to reach certain places. I'd catch glimpses of movement just beyond my vision, fleeting shapes darting away when I turned my head. I told myself it was the stress of the move, fatigue, the long hours spent unpacking and trying to settle in. I was rational. I wasn't the type to jump to conclusions about ghosts or hauntings. But as the days wore on, I could no longer ignore the peculiarities. One night, as I was lying in bed, the whispering began again, faint and indistinct, like a distant wind or leaves rustling in the night. I sat up, straining to hear, but the sound vanished the moment I focused on it. I lay back down, my heartbeat slowly returning to normal. It wasn't until I reached over to turn off the bedside lamp that I saw it. A figure, just a silhouette, darker than the surrounding darkness, standing at the far end of the room. It wasn't shaped like a person exactly, its edges were blurred, and its form seemed to ripple like black smoke. I froze, staring at it, but it didn't move. For a moment, I thought it might be a trick of the light, a strange shadow cast by the lamp. But then it shifted. The shape elongated, stretching unnaturally upward until its head brushed the ceiling. A pair of dim, hollow eyes formed, staring straight at me. I couldn't breathe. It was as though the air had thickened, pressing in on me from all sides. The figure remained motionless for several seconds, then it dissolved, fading back into the darkness. The rational part of me insisted it was sleep paralysis. I'd read about it before, waking up but being unable to move, seeing shadowy figures. It was all very common, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. I turned off the light and forced myself to go back to sleep, trying to convince myself it had all been in my head. The next day, I worked longer than usual, eager to distract myself. I spent hours hunched over my laptop, writing until the lines on the screen blurred together. By the time I finally stopped, the sun had set and the house was steeped in shadow. As I stood up, I glanced at the clock. Midnight. I rubbed my eyes, stretching the stiffness from my back, and was about to head upstairs when I heard the sound. A soft scraping noise coming from the living room. I paused, listening. The house was old. It could have been the wood settling, or the wind rattling the window panes. I took a step forward, and the sound came again, louder this time, like nails dragging across wood. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the living room. The beam cut through the darkness, casting a pale glow over the furniture. Everything seemed normal. But as I turned to leave, I saw a figure standing in the corner, right where the shadows bled together. It was the same as before. A tall, featureless silhouette with hollow eyes. Only this time it moved. It drifted forward, gliding rather than walking, its dark form rippling like water. I stumbled back, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure stopped a few feet away, and for a heartbeat I could feel it watching me, scrutinizing me. I raised the flashlight, and as the beam touched the figure, it vanished. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed up, every light in the house on, pacing back and forth with a cold sweat prickling my skin. The rational explanations no longer satisfied me. There was something in the house, something I couldn't explain. But when I called the real estate agent the next day to ask about the history of the place, he assured me there was nothing unusual. No tragic deaths, no prior reports of hauntings. The house had been on the market for years, just waiting for the right buyer. The days blurred together after that. I could barely focus on my writing. My thoughts kept drifting back to the shadows, to the way they seemed to bend and shift when I wasn't looking. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. I'd catch fragments of words, phrases that made no sense. "Join us," they said. "See us." And then, one night, the whispers stopped. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for that familiar sound. But there was only silence. I should have felt relieved, but instead the quiet unsettled me more. I sat up, glancing around the room, half expecting to see the shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed. But the room was empty. That's when I heard the voice, clear and unmistakable, coming from downstairs. "Come here," it said, a dry, rasping tone that sent chills down my spine. I didn't recognize the voice. It wasn't mine, and it didn't belong to anyone I knew. Against all reason, I found myself creeping down the stairs, the house eerily quiet around me. The voice called out again, coming from the living room. "We're waiting." I reached the doorway, my hand trembling as I flicked on the light switch. The room was empty, just as it had always been. But then I saw it, etched into the wooden floor, a pattern carved deep into the grain. A circle, surrounded by strange symbols that seemed to shift and change as I looked at them. In the center of the circle, the air seemed to waver, as if something was distorting the space. Before I could make sense of it, the temperature dropped, a sudden biting cold that numbed my fingers and prickled the hairs on the back of my neck. The shadows thickened, coiling around the edges of the room, and then they moved toward me, closing in like a tide. I backed away, my pulse racing, but the darkness was relentless. From within the depths, figures began to emerge, dozens of them, shadowy forms with hollow eyes. They surrounded me, their whispers overlapping, a cacophony of voices that I couldn't understand. I pressed myself against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps. And then, Out of the mass, one figure stepped forward, its form more solid than the others. It spoke in that same dry, rasping voice. "We are the shadows you deny, the darkness you refuse to see. You invited us here, with your fear, your isolation. You belong with us now." I tried to run, but the shadows surged forward, their cold tendrils wrapping around me. They pulled me down, and I fell, deeper and deeper, into a suffocating abyss. It felt as though I was drowning, my body sinking into a sea of darkness. I struggled, clawed at the air, but there was nothing to hold on to. The whispers grew louder, filling my mind, drowning out my thoughts. Then, just as I thought I would be lost forever, the darkness loosened its grip. I found myself lying on the living room floor, gasping for breath, the morning light filtering through the windows. The carved symbols were gone, as if they had never been there. But the shadows still lingered, lurking in the corners, waiting. I packed my things that day, abandoning the house and everything inside. I drove as far as I could, staying in cheap motels, never staying in one place for long. But no matter where I go, I still see them, the shadow people. They follow me, appearing in the corners of my vision, whispering to me when I'm alone. I can never escape them. They are always there, lurking just out of reach. And now, as I write this, I can see them again. The shadows are gathering, drawn to me as they always are. Their whispers are louder than ever, telling me that it's time. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I don't know if I even want to. Because the darkness is no longer something I fear. It's become something I crave. It calls to me, and soon I think I will answer. When I finally do, I will join the shadows. And maybe then, I'll understand what they really are. Or maybe I'll just disappear, swallowed by the darkness, lost forever in the company of the shadow people. I had no business being out there in the woods, but the thrill of solitude had always called to me. It was supposed to be a weekend away from the hustle and bustle, just me, a small cabin, and the wild. But as I stood at the entrance to that dilapidated, moss-covered cabin, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. I pushed open the creaking door, and it let out a groan like an old man waking from a long slumber. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and earth. Dust floated in the beams of fading afternoon light that slanted through the windows, the glass cracked and grimy. It was a single room with a small stone fireplace, a cot, and a rickety wooden table with a single chair. The perfect setting for a quiet retreat, or so I thought. As the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness swallowed the forest, the isolation took on a different tone. The woods outside fell unnaturally quiet, the usual symphony of crickets and rustling leaves replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to thrum against my eardrums. I tried to shake it off, lighting the old oil lamp on the table and huddling by the fireplace as I struggled to start a fire. That's when I noticed the marks, scratches, long deep gashes in the wood, crisscrossing the floor near the fireplace. They looked fresh, not worn or faded like I would expect in an old cabin. They were recent, the wood splintered and raw, as if something or someone had clawed at the floor with desperate ferocity. A chill skittered up my spine. The fire finally took, crackling weakly in the hearth, and I sank back into the chair, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. I brushed it off as nothing more than the jitters from being alone in an unfamiliar place. But a sudden thud from outside the cabin shattered that illusion. It wasn't the kind of sound a tree branch makes as it falls or an animal scurrying by. It was deliberate, solid, like a fist pounding against the earth. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I strained to hear over the crackling of the fire, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. Another thud followed, then another, in a rhythmic pattern. I stumbled to the window, peering out into the darkness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, in the faint moonlight, I noticed it, a shape moving between the trees. It was tall and hunched, its form just a blur in the shadows. but there was no mistaking that it wasn't any ordinary woodland creature. I stumbled backward, my mind racing to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was a deer or a bear. Yes, that had to be it. There was nothing to worry about. I was just letting my imagination get the best of me. Yet even as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The scratching sound came next, a grating noise against the cabin's exterior, like nails dragging along the wood. My pulse quickened, and I grabbed the fire poker, holding it in front of me like some kind of flimsy weapon. The scratching continued, circling the cabin, growing louder and more frenzied. Whatever was out there was toying with me. It knew I was inside, and it wanted me to know that. Suddenly the noise stopped. The abrupt silence was even more unnerving. I stood there, holding my breath. Every muscle in my body tensed as I waited for the next sound. Minutes passed. Nothing. I slowly lowered the poker, my heart still hammering when I heard it. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from outside the door. "Help me. Please." The voice was thin and desperate, like someone on the brink of death. But something about it wasn't right. There was an emptiness in it, a hollow quality that sent shivers coursing through me. It didn't sound human. I took a step toward the door, then stopped myself. What if this was some kind of trap? What if there was something out there luring me out, something that wasn't human at all? The voice called out again, louder this time, and I could hear the scratching once more, this time against the door itself. I backed away, my grip tightening on the fire poker as I fought to think clearly. The cabin seemed to close in around me, the shadows lengthening in the flickering firelight. I had to decide, open the door and confront whatever was outside, or stay locked inside and pray that it would go away. Before I could choose, the door burst open with a force that knocked me off my feet. I scrambled back, the poker slipping from my hand as I tried to regain my balance. There was nothing there. The doorway gaped open to the night, but whatever had been scratching and begging for help was gone. The forest outside was as dark and silent as ever. I shut the door and locked it, breathing heavily, my skin prickling with cold sweat. I glanced back at the scratches on the floor. They seemed deeper now, as if whatever was out there had made its way inside. I slowly backed away toward the fireplace, every instinct telling me to run, but not knowing where I would go. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing by the far wall, half hidden in the shadows. It was tall, emaciated, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin was a sickly gray, and its eyes, those sunken black pits, were fixed on me. I couldn't breathe. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stared. I stumbled backward, tripping over the chair, and the thing took a step forward. The wood groaned under its weight, and a low, guttural growl escaped its throat. I grabbed the lamp from the table and hurled it toward the figure, the glass shattering against the wall as flames erupted, casting a wild glow across the cabin. But the figure was gone. In its place, I saw only the scratches, now gouged deep into the walls and floor, as if the cabin itself was being torn apart from the inside. The fire was spreading, licking up the walls, and I knew I had to get out before it consumed the whole place. I stumbled out into the night, the cold air biting my skin as I ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. I didn't stop, didn't look back. The forest was a blur of shadows and moonlight, the sounds of my footsteps drowned out by the crackling of flames and the echo of that inhuman growl. Finally, after what felt like hours, I emerged onto a dirt road, my lungs burning and my limbs trembling. I collapsed, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. In the distance I could see the faint glow of the fire, but there was no sign of the cabin itself. It was as if it had been swallowed whole by the woods. I never did find out what that thing was, or if it was even real. Some part of me still wonders if I had imagined the whole thing, driven mad by isolation and fear. But deep down, I know there was something in that cabin, something ancient and malevolent. hiding in the dark places of the world, waiting for someone foolish enough to come looking for peace and quiet in its domain. I still have nightmares sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night with that same feeling that I'm being watched. And every now and then, just as I'm drifting off to sleep, I swear I can hear a faint scratching at my door, and the whisper of a voice, hollow and distant, pleading, "Help me, please."